Hey everybody, I hope you're doing splendid. This is a piece by Sergei Kudriashov titled Leon Trotsky and the Second World War. Let's see if Sergei Kudriashov has any biographical information on the internet. Something from the Wilson Center. It says Sergei Kudriashov studied history at the Russian Academy of Sciences. He published on the Second World War and Soviet history. Kudriashov is a scientific researcher at the German Historical Institute in Moscow. It looks like he edited a book titled Occupied Economies, An Economic History of Nazi-Occupied Europe, 1939 to 1945. So let's go. The question of Trotsky in the Second World War has not been much studied. There exist only a few works in which certain aspects of this subject have been dealt with, yet it is of particularly acute importance where events in the Soviet Union are concerned, since Trotsky was one of the few politicians, and on the eve of the war, perhaps the only one, who publicly criticized Stalin and his foreign policy from Marxist positions. This article will focus especially on the following questions: Trotsky's views on the causes and character of the Second World War, his analysis of the policies of the Western powers, of fascist Germany and of the USSR, and in particular his evaluation of Stalin's actions in the sphere of foreign policy in 1939 and 40. Trotsky's attitude to the war as a whole, his prognoses and program of action for the working class movement, and Trotsky's political and moral position, and his influence in 1939 to 40. New section: Trotsky on the causes and character of the Second World War. Trotsky saw the outbreak of another world war as a natural and inevitable process. He saw the sources of the war as lying in inter-imperialist contradictions, singling out particularly the striving by Germany and Japan for a repartition of the world. In Trotsky's view, these countries, together with Italy, had come late for reasons both internal and external to the distribution of spheres of influence, and their further development was hindered by their territorial limitations. In one of the interviews Trotsky gave in March 1939, he declared, quote, "The inevitability of the war flows first from the incurable crisis of the capitalist system, second from the fact that the present partition of our planet, that is to say, above all of the colonies, no longer corresponds to the economic specific weight of the imperialist states," end quote, Trotsky. Trotsky connected the origin of the war also with the crisis of democracy, of pacifism, and even fascism. The war was one way of resolving the contradictions, but at the same time it would prepare a fresh revolutionary explosion, which, as Trotsky saw it, would result in the triumph of Marxist ideas. Trotsky also considered the war inevitable because, in Trotsky's opinion, there were no forces present in the world that were capable of preventing it. The working class movement, thanks to the Stalinist leadership of the Comintern, was practically paralyzed and encountered the war in just as fragmented a condition as in 1914. Noting that the policies of the countries participating in the war were based on imperialist interests, Trotsky defined its character from the start as a predatory imperialist conflict. At the same time, Trotsky saw as the main danger to peace fascist Germany and fascism generally, and called for active struggle against this. New section: Trotsky on the foreign policy and actions of the Stalinist leadership on the eve of and at the beginning of the war. From the beginning of the 1930s, even before the fascists came to power in Germany, Trotsky frequently said that for Stalin there would be nothing better than cooperation with Hitler. He noted that on the 4th of March 1933, when Hitler was already firmly in the saddle, Izvestia wrote with pride that the USSR was the only country that bore no hostility towards Germany, and this, quote, regardless of the form and composition of the government of the Reich, end quote. It is interesting that although he lacked complete information, Trotsky, possessing as he did a subtle psychological understanding of Stalin, was able to perceive with precision the tendency in which relations between Stalin and Hitler would develop, their spiritual closeness, and he proved correct in forecasting a future alliance between them. In April 1938, long before the signing of the pact, Trotsky wrote openly that fascism was gaining victory after victory, and its chief helper in all parts of the world was Stalinism. The bacchanality of Stalinist repressions caused the question of the nature of the Soviet state to assume special acuteness in the revolutionary circles in the West. Was it a socialist workers' state whose interest Stalin was expressing, and what, on the social plane, was the Soviet bureaucracy? A number of activists in the working class movement, including some of Trotsky's supporters, put forward the view that the Soviet party state bureaucracy was nothing other than a, quote, new class, end quote, performing the function of exploiter. From this conclusion, there inevitably followed the question of whether it would be expedient to defend such a state in the event of war. Those who held that the, quote, new class, end quote, doctrine were inclined to take up a position of revolutionary defeatism. That is to say that if war should come, this might facilitate the downfall of the bureaucracy, and so there was no need to call for defense of the USSR. Intervening actively in the discussion, Trotsky sharply opposed that view. Just a side note, this is a pretty simplified understanding of the opponents of the unconditional defense of the USSR. They believed in the defense of the Soviet Union, to my understanding at least. They believed in the defense of the Soviet Union against imperialist attack, but that did not consist of supporting the Soviet Union in its policies of annexation in places like Poland, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, places like that. I think that the workers' opposition did not view. Some people tried to make the Soviet annexation or invasion of Poland into like some kind of defensive measure, and not like the product of a agreement between Hitler and Stalin, which history seems to vindicate that was actually the case, that it was a dividing of the spoils between the two expansionist states in Poland. The idea that the USSR was not worthy of defense in the case of, say, I don't know, invasion or something like that, that they were indifferent to whether like the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, is a misrepresentation of their views. Anyway, with good grounds, Trotsky observed that the fact that the USSR did not come in within the generally accepted definitions of Marxist sociology did not at all signify that the Soviet Union had, in its essence, ceased to be a proletarian state. Real life very often diverges from theory. In Trotsky's opinion, what was needed was to make use of the Marxist dialectical method to try and explain how the Soviet state had evolved and to define its nature. Trotsky was convinced that Stalinism had not succeeded in destroying the fundamental achievement of the October Revolution, the expropriation of private property, and therefore the Soviet state in the 1930s was for him still basically a workers' state. But this state was gradually decaying and disintegrating. The main reason for this process of degradation was Stalinism, which Trotsky wrote was not an abstraction of, quote, dictatorship, but an immense bureaucratic reaction against the proletarian dictatorship in a backward and isolated country. Quote, Stalinism reestablished the most offensive forms of privilege, imbued inequality with a provocative character, strangled mass self-activity under police absolutism, transformed administration into a monopoly of the Kremlin oligarchy, and regenerated the fetishism of power in forms the absolute monarchy dared not dream of, end quote. Trotsky considered that the proletariat, ruling in a single backward country, nevertheless continued to be an oppressed class. The source of the oppression was world imperialism, and the Soviet bureaucracy served as the transmission mechanism for this oppression. In Trotsky's thinking, the bureaucracy was not an independent class, but an instrument of classes. According to the bureaucracy, the USSR objectively served the interests of the imperialist bourgeoisie. Trotsky considered that there were in the USSR between 12 and 15 million privileged persons concentrating in their hands about half of the national income and calling this state of affairs, quote, socialism, end quote. Trotsky's view deserves attention, but evidently, through insufficient information, Trotsky exaggerated the degree of alienation of the bureaucracy and Stalinism from the social order existing in the USSR. For Trotsky, Stalinism was a disease, an anomaly in development, and on that level it is difficult not to agree with him. At the same time, however, Trotsky viewed Stalinism too much as a political superstructural phenomenon. Consequently, Trotsky, I would agree with that sentence right there. I was just having that thought. It's almost weird. At the same time, however, he viewed Stalinism too much as a political superstructural phenomenon. Consequently, Trotsky supposed that it would be enough to remove Stalin and break up the bureaucracy for the healthy principle engendered by the October Revolution, meaning property in the hands of the people as a whole, to make itself felt. One might blame Trotsky for approaching the problem in a simplistic way, but that would be unjust. Trotsky's service was precisely that he was one of the first in the world to study Stalinism as a historical phenomenon, and the extent to which Stalinism had damaged the structure of Soviet society, its politics, economics, culture, science, etc., became clear only in the period of perestroika. Trotsky drew a distinction of principle between Stalinism on the one hand and Bolshevism and socialism on the other. Quote, Stalinism originated not as an organic outgrowth of Bolshevism, but as a negation of Bolshevism consummated in blood, end quote. Trotsky constantly defended Lenin and Leninism from Stalinist distortions and actively opposed attempts to put the sign of equality between Lenin and Stalin. Trotsky's line of argument acquired topical importance in the period of perestroika. Discussing the nature of the Soviet state, Trotsky remarked with reason that Stalin performed a dual function. He served the bureaucracy and thereby the world bourgeoisie, but he could not serve the bureaucracy unless he preserved the social foundations which the bureaucracy exploited in its own interests. In defending the USSR, Stalin and the bureaucracy were defending first and foremost themselves within the USSR. But this defense was being effected by methods which prepared the way for an all-round collapse of Soviet society. It was just for this reason Trotsky thought that the Stalin clique and the hated bureaucracy had to be overthrown, but overthrown by the peoples of the USSR themselves. This was a task they could not entrust to anyone else. Trotsky resolutely rejected the charge brought against Trotsky by some bourgeois newspapers that he wanted to help Hitler beat Stalin. He wrote, quote, "The USSR and Stalin are not the same thing. I am an adversary of Stalin, but not the USSR, ... Hitler's victory would signify frightful economic, political, and national slavery for all the peoples of the USSR, and above all, the restoration of the rights of private property. Of private capital, To defend the nationalization of the means of production realized by the October Revolution against Hitler as against all other imperialists, I consider this elementary duty of every socialist. Consider this the elementary duty of every socialist, beginning with myself," end quote, Trotsky. At the same time, Trotsky stressed that defense of the USSR did not in the least mean rapprochement with the Kremlin bureaucracy, adopting the Kremlin bureaucracy's policy or reconciling oneself to the policies of its allies. Trotsky's slogan of, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote, gave rise to many disputes among his supporters. He patiently explained that this was a vital necessity, since facilitating the overthrow of the Stalin clique by supporting an external enemy would in practice mean helping to destroy the state which was objectively the stronghold of socialism. Trotsky said that the slogan again, this is just a total misrepresentation of the views of the third camp. They did not view it as a matter of indifference whether the Nazis invaded and conquered the Soviet Union. Trotsky said that the slogan, quote, unconditional defense of the USSR, end quote, did not put any conditions to the Stalinist bureaucracy. This then meant that regardless of the occasion or cause of war, the social foundations of the USSR are to be defended if and when they threatened with attack by imperialism. In connection with events taking place in the Soviet Union, and especially in connection with Stalin's foreign policy after the signing of the pact with Germany, there was much discussion in the West concerning the similarity between fascist Germany and the USSR. Thus, a new word, quote, communazi, end quote, made its appearance, and an editorial in the New York Times of the 18th of September 1939 affirmed that, quote, Hitlerism is brown communism, Stalinism is red fascism, end quote. Trotsky opposed the identification of fascism with socialism. For him, they were fundamentally opposed social systems. In the manifesto of the Fourth International, written by Trotsky, it was expressly emphasized that, quote, fascism is a chemically pure distillation of the culture of imperialism, end quote. Trotsky. Fascism was engendered by a society based on private property, whereas socialism was based on public ownership of the means of production. This difference Trotsky considered to be one of principle. Fascism and Stalinism were a different matter. Stalinism had transformed the Soviet Union into a new prison of peoples, and under Stalinism's influence, the political regime in the socialist country, in Trotsky's opinion, had finally come to resemble that of a penal battalion. Trotsky agreed with Mussolini when he said that nobody in the whole world had struck such blows at the idea of communism, the proletarian revolution, and exterminated communists with such ferocity as Stalin. Stressing the fact that the political methods of Stalin and Hitler differed little from each other, and turning attention to the possible development of Stalinism in the direction of fascism, Trotsky nevertheless did not identify fascism with Stalinism. Being parasitic upon socialism and exploiting the results of the revolution, Stalinism was obliged for the sake of self-preservation to do something also for socialism. I'll finish the paragraph and then say what I was going to say. Consequently, Stalinism was not a mirror image of fascism. So, while pointing to the similarity between fascism and Stalinism, Trotsky resolutely opposed the attempts to place the sign of equality between fascism and socialism. He keeps using this word socialism, and maybe I'm misreading it, but Trotsky definitely did not view the Soviet Union as socialist. He viewed it as a degenerated worker state, which is problematic in and of itself. But he by no means viewed it as a finished socialist society. He did not identify nationalization of the means of production with socialism, but he did identify the nationalization of the means of production with a worker state. Back to the text. Trotsky was, in fact, the first to criticize one of the basic postulates of the doctrine of totalitarianism, which acquired wide popularity in the West a little later. Although he did indeed often use the term, quote, totalitarian, end quote, he never gave it any scientific significance. For him, the term was merely a graphic adjective to indicate something cruel, oppressive, and dictatorial, but no way of a sociological concept containing the notion that fascism and socialism were the same. I believe there are certain places, if you refer to Hillel Tickton, obviously Trotsky was writing in the period before Barbarossa and the Holocaust, but he definitely, in certain senses, in certain places, said that Stalinism was worse politically than fascism. Back to the text. With hindsight, we can confidently assert that those Western scholars who tried to make sense of Soviet history by means of the doctrine of totalitarianism failed to arrive at solid results. If one starts from the basic positions of the doctrine as put forward by the works of Arendt, Friedrich, and Brzezinski, one cannot understand why the Soviet state has developed and achieved certain successes, and why such a phenomenon as perestroika is possible. It is all the more surprising that the doctrine of totalitarianism has acquired, quote, new, end quote, life in the Soviet Union. Some writers, intoxicated by glasnost, are uncritically borrowing many propositions from out-of-date Western publications and passing off their reflections of a new stage in knowledge. The non-aggression treaty of the 23rd of August 1939 between the USSR and Fascist Germany did not take Trotsky and his supporters by surprise. After Munich, and especially after the 18th Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, Trotsky regarded the outcome of events as most likely. He observed sarcastically that for the Stalinists it was a lot harder to fight fascism than to shoot and poison old Bolsheviks. In an article with the eloquent title, quote, "Stalin's Capitulation," end quote, Trotsky described the General Secretary's speech at the 18th Congress as a feeler put out to Hitler. He wrote, quote, "During the last 3 years, Stalin called all the companions of Lenin agents of Hitler. Stalin exterminated the flower of the armed forces commanders. Stalin shot, discharged, and deported about 300,000 officers, all under the same charge of being agents of Hitler or his allies. After having dismembered the party and decapitated the army, now Stalin is openly posting his own candidacy for the role of ... principal agent of Hitler," end quote, Trotsky. Nearly half a year before the pact was signed, Trotsky firmly emphasized that an agreement between Stalin and Hitler would change nothing essential in the counter-revolutionary function of the Kremlin oligarchy. In his view, it would merely expose this function, make it more brazen, and hasten the collapse of illusions and falsifications. Observing the course of events in the autumn of 1939, Trotsky was able to convince himself that he had been right. On the one hand, he saw the Soviet-German pact as a sign of the degree to which the Soviet bureaucracy had degenerated, of its contempt for the international working-class movement, the communists included, while on the other he saw it in a manifestation of the weakness of the USSR, the Kremlin's panic in the face of Germany, a capitulation of Stalin before fascist imperialism with the end of preserving the Soviet oligarchy. While pointing out that by means of the pact Stalin had brought himself the possibility of staying out of the war in the immediate future, Trotsky very correctly described the pact of non-aggression as an agreement to maintain, quote, "a passive attitude toward German aggression," end quote. At the same time, Trotsky considered the alliance between Stalin and Hitler as offensive in character, with the partners' roles strictly defined. Hitler carried on military operations while Stalin functioned as his quartermaster. Fascist Germany received supplies, of course, not only from the Soviet Union, but the Nazi government regarded the supplies from the USSR as of very great importance. Stalin, however, did not hurry, showed unwillingness to compromise, and insisted on reciprocal supplies of equal value. The negotiations aimed at concluding an economic agreement between Germany and the USSR had produced no tangible result by February 1940, and it was only then that Stalin, having received a personal message from Ribbentrop, agreed to meet the Germans' demands. The German foreign minister, Ribbentrop, had pointed out to Stalin that the question of the speed and amount of the supplies required could not be looked at from the economic standpoint alone, but must be linked with the general political understanding which had been arrived at between the two countries. Ribbentrop resentfully reminded Stalin that, quote, "this understanding has meanwhile made it possible ... for the Soviet government to realize its desires regarding the former Polish territory and to develop and protect its interest in the Baltic," end quote, and that, quote, "this was possible not least of all because of the German victory in Poland," end quote. All of which, according to Ribbentrop, provided serious justification for Germany's desire to obtain support from the USSR now, as it continued the war against France and Britain by means of as rapid and extensive deliveries of raw materials as possible. With Stalin's intervention, the situation changed abruptly, and on the 8th of February, the parties reached agreement. According to the German documents, Stalin personally proposed that the Soviet Union provide supplies to the value of 650 to 660 million Reichsmarks over a period of 18 months, i.e. until August 1941, while Germany's reciprocal supplies to the USSR should be spread over a period of 2 years and 3 months. The Nazi officials did not conceal their profound satisfaction. On the 11th of February 1940, there was also signed a secret protocol by which the USSR undertook to purchase metals and other commodities in third countries and sell them to Germany. The head of the German economic mission of the Soviet Union, K. Schnurre, one second, I'll look this person up. I don't really see much. It just that the German Wikipedia says that Karl Schnurre was a German diplomat and lawyer. Back to the text. The head of the German economic mission in the Soviet Union, K. Schnurre, fittingly evaluated in a memorandum of the 26th of February 1940, quote, the desire of the Soviet government to help Germany, end quote, to supply even more than was needed. Schnurre noted sympathetically that the USSR had to deliver these supplies to some extent at the expense of its own supply situation. In his view, the agreement opened for Germany a wide door in the East, as a result of which the effects of the British blockade were greatly weakened. Thus, even though Trotsky did not have all the information at his disposal, he was not far from the truth when he called Stalin Hitler's quartermaster. Think me dumb, but I don't know what the fucking word quartermaster means. According to Wikipedia, quartermaster is a military term, the meaning of which depends on the country in service. In land armies, quartermaster is an officer who supervises logistics and requisitions, manages stores or barracks, and distributes supplies and provisions. In many navies, a quartermaster is a seaman or a petty officer with responsibility for navigating and operation of the helm of a ship. The term quartermaster appears to derive from the title of a German royal officer, Quartiermeister. This term meant, quote, master of quarters, end quote, where, quote, quarters, end quote, refers to lodging or accommodation. Alternatively, quartermaster could have been derived from, quote, master of the quarterdeck, end quote, where the helmsman and captain controlled the ship. The term's first use in English was as a naval term, which entered English in the 15th century via the equivalent French and Dutch naval titles Quartier Mate and Quartiermeister, that's Dutch, I don't know how to pronounce Dutch words, respectively. The term began to refer to army officers in English around 1600. Back to the text. Also wanted to look up the British blockade. The blockade of Germany, 1939 to 1945. The blockade of Germany, also known as the Economic War, involved operations carried out during World War II by the British Empire and by France in order to restrict the supplies of minerals, fuel, metals, food, and textiles needed by Nazi Germany and later by Fascist Italy in order to sustain their war efforts. The Economic War consisted mainly of a naval blockade which formed part of the wider Battle of the Atlantic, but also included the bombing of economically important targets and the preclusive buying of war materials from neutral countries in order to prevent their sale to the Axis powers. The blockade had 4 phases. The first period, from the beginning of European hostilities in September 1939 to the end of the, quote, phony war saw both the Allies and the Axis powers intercepting neutral merchant ships to seize deliveries en route to their respective enemies. Naval blockades at this time proved less than effective because the Axis could get crucial materials from the Soviet Union until June 1941, while Berlin used harbors in Spain to import war materials into Germany. The second period began after the rapid Axis occupation of the majority of the European landmass, Scandinavia, Benelux, France, or Benelux, I don't know if I'm saying that right, France, and the Balkans in 1940 to 41, resulting in Axis control of major centers of industry and agriculture. The third period started in December 1941 after the attack on Pearl Harbor by the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service brought the U.S. officially into the European War. The final period came after the tide of war finally turned against the Axis after heavy military defeats up to and after D-Day in June 1944, which led to gradual Axis withdrawals from the occupied territories in the face of the overwhelming Allied military offensives. Okay. Back to the text. With regard to the pact, Trotsky drew attention particularly to a question of political principle, namely the possibility of agreement between a socialist state and a capitalist states. A socialist state and capitalist states. On this question, Trotsky fully shared Lenin's position in his work Left-Wing Communism and Infantile Disorder. Lenin argued that in the practical political questions confronting a specific historical moment, it is important to identify compromises which are intolerable because they involve opportunist treachery fatal to the revolutionary class, and to exert all efforts to expose and combat them. But he also wrote that, quote, one must learn to distinguish between a man who has given up his money and firearms to bandits so as to lessen the evil they can do and to facilitate their capture and execution, and a man who gives his money and firearms to bandits so as to share the loot, end quote. Lenin. Applying Lenin's attitude to compromises to the case of Stalin's pact with Hitler, we can conclude that Stalin was one of those who became, in Lenin's words, quote, accomplices in imperialist banditry, end quote. Agreeing with Lenin, Trotsky showed on the eve of the Second World War that given the isolated situation of the socialist state, it was compelled to one extent or another to enter into agreements with the imperialists. But he pointed plainly to the criterion to which the Soviet Republic had adhered in its policy after 1917, namely that the workers in the capitalist countries were not to be bound by any of these empirical agreements made by the worker states where their class struggle against their own bourgeoisie was concerned. Stalin's compromise transgressed the limits of the permissible, and in Molotov's words, ensured for Germany, quote, calm confidence in the East, end quote. Trotsky acutely notices that it was characteristic of Stalin to proclaim ideological solidarity with whatever state he allied himself with. One has to agree that Trotsky was right when he wrote openly in 1939 that, quote, the fundamental trait of Stalin's international policy in recent years has been this, that he trades in the working class movement just as he trades in oil, manganese, and other goods, end quote. Trotsky emphasized that Germany's goodwill could be bought only by cooperating in Germany's plans. Trotsky forecast prophetically that one of Stalin's main concessions would be the cessation of anti-fascist propaganda. Stalin went even further than that and ratified his, quote, friendship, end quote, with Hitler with the blood of convinced anti-fascists. In September 1939, intensive contacts between the NKVD and the Gestapo. In September 1939, intensive contacts began between the NKVD and Gestapo. One second. Wikipedia says, there's a Wikipedia page for Gestapo NKVD conferences. And Wikipedia says, the Gestapo NKVD conferences were a series of security police meetings organized in late 1939 and early 1940 by Germany and the Soviet Union following the invasion of Poland in accordance with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. The meetings enabled both NKVD and Gestapo to pursue specific goals and aims as outlined independently by Hitler and Stalin with regard to the acquired formerly Polish territories. The conference was held by the Gestapo and the NKVD officials in several Polish cities. In spite of their differences on other issues, both Heinrich Himmler and Lavrenti Beria had similar objectives as far as the fate of pre-war Poland was concerned. The objectives were agreed upon during the signing of the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty of the 28th of September 1939. I'm going to read that one too. The attack on Poland ended with the Nazi-Soviet parade in Brzesk, B-R-Z-S with an accent, C with an accent, which was held on the 22nd of September 1939. Brzesk was the location of the first Nazi-Soviet meeting organized on the 27th of September 1939, in which the prisoner exchange was decided prior to the signing of mutual agreements in Moscow a day later. In the following month, the Gestapo and the NKVD met in Lvov, L-W-O with an accent, W, to discuss the fate of the civilian populations during the radical reorganization of the annexed territories. They met again in occupied Przemysl, P-R-Z-E-M-Y-S with an accent L, at the end of November, because Przemysl, I don't know how to say that, was a border crossing between the two invaders. The next series of meetings began in September 1939, a month after the transfer of Polish prisoners of war. The conferences were held in occupied Krakow in the general government on the 6th to 7th December 1939 and continued for the next 2 days in the resort town of Zakopane, or Zakopane, Z-A-K-O-P-A-N-E, in the Tatra Mountains of southern Poland, 100 kilometers from Krakow, on the 8th to 9th of December 1939. The Zakopane Conference is the most remembered. From the Soviet side, several higher officers of the NKVD secret police participated in the meetings, while the German host provided a group of experts from the Gestapo. And Wikipedia says, the German-Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty was a second supplementary protocol of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact of the 23rd of August 1939. The Soviet Boundary and Friendship Treaty was a secret clause as amended on the 28th of September 1939 by Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union after their joint invasion and occupation of sovereign Poland. It was signed by Joachim von Ribbentrop and Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign ministers of Germany and the Soviet Union respectively, in the presence of Joseph Stalin. And the small portion of the protocol which superseded the first treaty was publicly announced, while the spheres of influence of Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union remained secret. The third secret protocol of the pact was signed on the 10th of January 1941 by Friedrich Werner von Schulenburg and Molotov, in which Germany renounced its claims on a part of Lithuania west of the Jejupa River, S with like an inverted arrow on top of it, E, S with another inverted arrow on top of it, U, P, and E with a dot over it, river. Only a few months after this, Germany started its invasion of the Soviet Union. Okay, so back to the text. In September 1939, intensive contacts began between the NKVD and the Gestapo. A large group of German anti-fascists and Jews who had escaped into the USSR from Nazi persecution were handed over to the Gestapo. Anti-fascists from other countries and also Soviet citizens who did not adjust themselves to, quote, friendship with Germany were subjected to repressive measures. all of which gave Hitler grounds for saying on the 4th of January 1941 that, quote, as long as Stalin was alive, it was absolutely impossible that Russia would start anything against Germany, end quote. It seems that Trotsky is right when he noted that personal motives played a part in Stalin's policy towards Poland. He had in view the defeat suffered by the Russian army's forces before Warsaw in 1920, which happened not without some, quote, help, end quote, from Stalin. Now in the autumn of 1939, Stalin took his peculiar revenge. Stalin's personal motives showed themselves also during the war between the USSR and Germany. Especially striking was Stalin's demonstrative unwillingness to give substantial help to the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. In my view, Trotsky was right in objecting to any comparison of the non-aggression pact to the Brest-Litovsk peace treaty, calling such comparison, quote, forgery. Trotsky's argument retained its importance today, since apologists for the pact are trying as before to present the matter as though the situation in 1939 was like that in 1918. Trotsky emphatically declared that there was nothing in common between the two treaties. In 1918, the Bolsheviks were forced to accept conditions for a peace treaty imposed on them in an ultimatum, since what was at stake was a matter of life or death for the young Soviet Republic, which lacked sufficient forces and means to resist external aggression. The Bolsheviks appreciated the full gravity of their compromise with Germany and carried out extensive explanatory work among the masses, and no one dared even to think of, quote, friendship, end quote, with Kaiser Wilhelm. Any such idea would have been taken as a betrayal of the revolution's ideals. The Bolsheviks' conscience was clear when they signed the Brest Treaty. Moreover, the Brest Treaty, unlike the pact, was not accompanied by any secret protocol by which the fate of third countries was decided. Trotsky did not know about the secret protocol and the subsequent secret agreements between Stalin and Hitler, but as an experienced politician who followed the course of events, he realized that there was some sort of understanding between them. I was just reading pieces from the Workers' Party today, and it seems like they were, I don't know, I can't remember, maybe I'm reading something that's from later, but they were just like, they were absolutely of the opinion, like, yeah, this isn't just like Soviet annexations, like, just for themselves, but their, like, agreement for the division of Poland between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany was an active participation in Western imperialism, right? So they had this idea that, like, not only was Stalinism engaging in the Stalinist USSR was engaging in imperialist annexations, but also creating preconditions for Nazi annexations. Yeah, I can't remember though. That might have been later, but I think they were definitely of the opinion, like, no, this is clearly a deal. And it seems that, at least what's saying here, I can't really confirm or deny this right now, but it seems like Trotsky had a similar idea. Trotsky did not know about the secret protocol and the subsequent secret agreements between Stalin and Hitler, but as an experienced politician who followed the course of events, Trotsky realized that there was some sort of understanding between them. Today it is already clear, not only from the German but also from the published Soviet documents, that the initiative for the secret protocol came from the Soviet side. Today it is already clear, not only from the German but also from the published Soviet documents, that the initiative for the secret protocol came from the Soviet side. Defining the Kremlin's policy as the policy of, quote, the Bonapartist bureaucracy of a degenerated worker state under conditions of imperialist encirclement, end quote. Trotsky noted that, defining the Kremlin's policy as the policy of the, quote, Bonapartist bureaucracy of a degenerated worker state under conditions of imperialist encirclement, end quote. Trotsky noted that an inevitable consequence of the alliance with Germany was Stalin's invasion of Poland and the Baltic states. Trotsky frequently pointed out that behind all the rhetoric of Soviet propaganda, the basic motive of Stalin's policy was his fear of Hitler, fear of war with Hitler. In Trotsky's opinion, the circumstances on the western frontier of the USSR were developing in such a way that Stalin could escape war only by fleeing forward, not through giving up old positions, but through taking new positions. Quote, in his alliance with Hitler and on Hitler's initiative, Stalin decided to take, quote, guarantees against Hitler, end quote. Thus, according to Trotsky, the pact with Germany was not so much the result of accidental circumstances as the natural outcome of Stalin's cynical policy. Having created inside the country an atmosphere of terror and universal suspicion, and having annihilated millions of people, Stalin and his circle had themselves created the situation in which, in order to stay out of the war, it was necessary to indulge Hitler. Unlike the Bolsheviks in 1918, Stalin soiled himself with his pact and discredited many communist parties. Trotsky rightly emphasized that the first victim of the pact of the 23rd of August 1939 was the Comintern. Stalin actually compelled the communist parties of Europe to collaborate with the fascists. During the German onslaught in France, the French communists directly helped the Germans by their activities. Ribbentrop wrote about that to Caino, C-A-I-N-O, with some satisfaction. Who the fuck is this? Where is it? Galeazzo Ciano, who lived from 1903 to 1944, was an Italian diplomat and politician who served as foreign minister in the government of his father-in-law Benito Mussolini from 1936 until 1943. During this period, he was widely seen as Mussolini's most probable successor as head of government. One second, sorry, I gotta move. I'm in the sun. Gotta move out of the sun. I can't see my laptop. Excuse me. Ciano was the son, Galeazzo Ciano was the son of Admiral Costanzo Ciano, a founding member of the National Fascist Party. Father and son both took part in Mussolini's March on Rome in 1922. Galeazzo Ciano saw action in the Italo-Ethiopian War 1935-36 and was appointed foreign minister on his return. Following a series of Axis defeats in the Second World War, Galeazzo Ciano began pushing for Italy's exit, and he was dismissed from his post as a result. Galeazzo Ciano then served as ambassador to the Vatican. In July 1943, Galeazzo Ciano was among the members of the Grand Council of Fascism that forced Mussolini's ousting and subsequent arrest. Ciano proceeded to flee to Germany but was arrested and handed over to Mussolini's new regime based in Salo, the Italian Social Republic. Mussolini ordered Galeazzo Ciano's death, and in January 1944 he was executed by firing squad. Galeazzo Ciano wrote and left behind a diary that has been used as a source by several historians, including William Shearer, in his The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, published in 1960, and in the 4-hour HBO documentary drama Mussolini and I, released in 1985. Let me get back to the text. Ribbentrop wrote about that to Ciano with some satisfaction. The communists even appealed to the occupying authorities for permission to publish La Humanité. On the 1st of July 1940, an issue of the paper appeared in which de Gaulle was branded as a British, quote, agent, end quote. In this period, Trotsky wrote with sarcasm that Stalin and his communists were undoubtedly the most valuable agents of imperialism. Okay, new section. Trotsky's moral positions, his program, and prognoses. Trotsky's morality was a class morality. Throughout his conscious life in politics, he saw defense of the interests of the proletariat as the sacred duty of a revolutionary. The morality of the proletarian revolution was for Trotsky the highest stage of human morality because it was based on loyalty to the cause of emancipating the oppressed. On the eve of the war, especially after the Stalinist show trials, the question of the Bolsheviks' morality became topical, or more precisely, many media of mass information in the West, including so-called specialist newspapers, identified Bolshevism with Stalinism and Lenin with Stalin, developing a campaign in which the Bolsheviks were accused of, quote, amoralism, end quote. To this, Trotsky sharply replied with a polemical pamphlet, Their Morals and Ours. It is noteworthy that Trotsky in exile rarely failed to reply to attacks on Lenin and Bolshevism, and in my opinion his arguments are still valid today. Under conditions of perestroika in the Soviet Union, some writers have made it fashionable to compare Lenin to Stalin and also to compare Stalin to Trotsky, presenting them as uterine brothers born of the October Revolution who committed equivalent crimes. Trotsky's retort would hardly be to the liking of today's, quote, intellectuals liberated by glasnost. He wrote, quote, verily, boundless intellectual and moral obtuseness is required to identify the reactionary police morality of Stalinism with the revolutionary morality of the Bolsheviks, end quote. Trotsky pointed out that the state created by the Bolsheviks reflected not only the mind and will of Bolshevism, but also the cultural level of the country, the social composition of the population, the pressure of a barbarous past, and of no less barbarous world imperialism. Consequently, to depict the process of degeneration of the Soviet state as the evolution of pure Bolshevism meant ignoring social reality in the name of one of its elements, logically isolated from the rest. In Trotsky's view, by taking state power, the party obtained the means to influence the development of society with power that had been unavailable to it previously. But as against that, the party was itself subjected to a tenfold greater influence from all other elements in society. It could be ejected from power by direct blows from hostile forces. In the long term, it could, after taking power, undergo degeneration from within. Trotsky considered that this dialectic of history was what was not grasped by those who, quote, tried to find in the decay of the Stalinist bureaucracy an annihilating argument against Bolshevism, end quote. Trotsky wrote that the morality of any party is derived from the interest which this party represents. The morality of Bolshevism, which included self-sacrifice, disinterestedness, audacity, and contempt for every kind of tinsel and falsehood, was derived from revolutionary intransigence in the service of the oppressed. The Stalinist bureaucracy imitated in this domain the words and gestures of Bolshevism, but when, quote, intransigence and, quote, inflexibility were applied by a police apparatus in the service of a privileged minority, they became a source of demoralization and gangsterism. Consequently, Trotsky decisively counterpoised the revolutionary heroism of the Bolsheviks to the cynicism of the Stalinists. Trotsky reacted no less sharply to attempts to ascribe to the Bolsheviks the so-called, quote, Jesuit principle. that, quote, the ends justify the means, end quote. He said that dialectical materialism knows no duality between ends and means. The ends flow naturally from the movement of history. The means are organically subordinated to the end. The immediate end becomes the means to a further end. But the end itself, Trotsky declared, must be justified. In his view, from the standpoint of Marxism, an end is justified if it leads to increasing the power of man over nature and to the abolition of the power of man over man. At the same time, this does not signify that all and every means are permissible for the attainment of that end. Trotsky stressed that a great revolutionary end spurns those base means and methods which set one section of the working class against others, or which attempt to make the masses happy without their participation, or lower the faith of the masses in themselves and their organization, replacing it by worship of, quote, leaders. Above all, and irreconcilably, revolutionary morality rejects servility in relation to the bourgeoisie and haughtiness in relation to the working people. That is to say, those characteristics in which petty bourgeois pedants and moralists are thoroughly steeped. In this same connection, Trotsky waxed sarcastic at the attempt to counterpoise to proletarian morality the morality of, quote, common sense, end quote, or, quote, generally recognized, end quote, rules of morality. There are indeed certain elementary moral precepts developed in the course of human history, but in Trotsky's view, these are indeterminate in character, and the extent of their action is extremely limited and unstable. Since morality itself is a product of social development, serves definite social interests, and is nothing immutable about it. Common sense proves adequate for bargaining, healing, writing articles, leading trade unions, voting in parliament, marrying and producing children. But when the same common sense tries to go beyond its valid limits into the arena of more complex generalizations, it exposes itself, according to Trotsky, as a mere clot of the prejudices of a particular class and a particular epoch. Trotsky did not like it when his activity was presented as a particular tendency called, quote, Trotskyism, and when his followers were called, quote, Trotskyists. If he happened to use these terms, he often preferred to put them between quotation marks. Trotsky saw himself as the continuer of Lenin's work, and the Bulletin of the Opposition was published as the organ of the, quote, Bolshevik Leninists, end quote. In my view, the difference between Lenin and Trotsky on the question of world revolutions, which have been artificially stirred up by Soviet propaganda and official historiography, provide no adequate basis for counterpoising Leninism to, quote, Trotskyism. Analysis of Trotsky's writings when in exile makes it possible to conclude that he was one of the few who publicly defended Leninism against Stalinism and against bourgeois criticism, and at the beginning of the Second World War, Trotsky seems to have remained the only Marxist who criticized Stalin's policy from Leninist positions. Perhaps from Leninist positions, but certainly not from Marxist positions. And in addition, there was also people who were like not affiliated with Trotsky, that were oppositionist, radical left socialists, who had some, at least very strong sympathies for the Bolshevik Revolution, including like independent Labor Party types, the right opposition groups. The POUM would probably be another example, even though the POUM was largely physically decimated, to my understanding at least, and then a lot of people emigrated to places like France out of Spain. But Trotsky's certainly was primary. I don't think any book had as wide a readership, for example, as like the Revolution Betrayed, or like any commentators on Russian affairs from a radical left perspective, from a critical radical left perspective, had as much attention or spotlight or readership or any of those things as Trotsky. That's certainly true. Anyway, Trotsky always expressed his views frankly. His position at the beginning of the war was consistent: against imperialism, against fascism, and against Stalinism, for socialism, and for the unconditional defense of the USSR. This is the strategic principle underlying the manifesto of the Fourth International and the Imperialist War and the Proletarian Revolution, which was adopted on the 26th of May 1940 by an extraordinary conference of the Fourth International. After fascist Germany's attack on the Soviet Union, the Executive Committee of the Fourth International issued a call to, quote, defend the USSR, end quote. One can say without exaggeration that the Fourth International, created by Trotsky, was one of the few political organizations in the world which had a fairly clear program under the conditions of the Second World War. The activity of the Fourth International after Trotsky's assassination calls for serious scientific study. On the eve of the war and during it, Trotsky frequently made prognoses, and what is interesting is that in his prognoses for the future he proved to be amazingly correct. Trotsky forecast the pact, the Soviet-German economic agreement, the changes in the policy of the Comintern and the European Communist parties, and Stalin's policy toward Western Ukraine and Western Belarusia, or Belarus, Belarusia, or Belarusia, Finland, and the Baltic states. It's spelled Belarussia, so I just always called it Belarus, but it's Belarusia, Russia. Finland and the Baltic states. Trotsky was sure that war between Germany and the USSR was only a question of time, however Stalin might strive to avoid it. Trotsky supposed that the war would inevitably lead to a revolutionary explosion in many countries, and in that he also proved to be right, but the war did not lead, as Trotsky hoped, to the downfall of capitalism and the triumph of socialist revolution, not in most countries of the world at least. Trotsky warned Western statesmen not to underestimate the defensive strength of the Red Army. The former People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs and chairman of the Revolutionary War Council of the Republic prophesied that in the event of an attack by Hitler on the USSR, the Red Army would put up a stubborn defense of its territory. Trotsky underestimated the strength of Stalinism's ability to adapt to changed conditions. Trotsky thought that the Stalinist bureaucracy would not survive the war, that Stalin's apogee was behind him, that the fall of his dictatorship near. Trotsky wanted very much to believe that this would happen, but even so voiced the supposition that, quote, defense against foreign intervention would undoubtedly strengthen the position of the bureaucracy, end quote. Alas, the war did not lead to the fall of Stalinism. On the contrary, victory over fascist Germany enhanced the prestige both of the system and of Stalin personally. Using its powerful apparatus of propaganda and repression, Stalinism succeeded in identifying its interests with those of the country and the consciousness of the Soviet people. When Trotsky asserted that, quote, the popular masses of the Soviet Union hate the greedy and cruel ruling caste, end quote, he obviously overestimated the level of consciousness of the working people. Nevertheless, at the beginning of the war, the Stalinist leadership did encounter organized protests by workers and peasants against the bureaucracy. There are documents in the Central Party Archive, in the section for the Department of Propaganda and Agitation in the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which give evidence of frequent strikes by workers and collective farmers. These strikes did not assume any clear expressed political character as protests against the prevailing regime. As a rule, they were directed against local party and Soviet officials. Thus, as a result of conduct by party bureaucrats who, trying above all to ensure their own safety, the autumn of 1942 saw disturbances in the Saratov region, which went so far as people leaving the party. Owing to the unreadiness of the administration to take account of the needs of the working people, there were frequent refusals to work on the part of working men employed in the Ivanovo textile mill named after Molotov. They resorted to a concealed form of strike, what was called, quote, dawdling, end quote. Although mistaken as regards to the concrete timing of the fall of the Stalinist dictatorship, Trotsky was certainly right on the main point. that Stalinism would inevitably be overthrown by the working people of the Soviet Union, and that Stalin's name, quote, would become a byword for the uttermost limits of human baseness, end quote. This is precisely the process that we now see unfolding in the USSR. I don't think Trotsky had this view of Stalinism being overthrown by the working people in that manner. Despite the hounding of Trotsky over many years by Stalinist and post-Stalinist propaganda and the deliberate distortions of his views by official historiography, Trotsky's name is returning to Soviet history. Many falsifications concerning Trotsky survive only because his works are inaccessible to the ordinary Soviet reader. With the publication of Trotsky's writings, which has begun in the USSR, these falsifications will fade away by themselves. Trotsky was never an enemy of socialism in the USSR. Trotsky was an irreconcilable opponent of Stalinism, and in struggle against it he had died. The attempt by some writers to put the sign of equality between Trotsky and Stalin shows their incompetence and the tenacity of, quote, anti-Trotskyist, end quote, stereotypes in social consciousness implanted by Stalinist propaganda itself. In descriptions of Trotsky, reference is often made to Lenin's statement about his, quote, non-Bolshevism, end quote. But Lenin did not explain in his, quote, testament, end quote, what meaning he was giving to the concept, quote, Bolshevism. To judge by the characterizations of the top party leaders, which Lenin provides in his, quote, letter to the Congress, none of them understood Bolshevism in the way that Lenin understood it. Besides, Trotsky then still had time to become a Bolshevik, and if by Bolshevism we understand profession of the ideas of historical and dialectical materialism, struggle for the interests of the oppressed, devotion to the idea of proletarian revolution and dictatorship of the proletariat, and honesty and struggle against ideological opponents, then, at the end of the 1930s, Trotsky was a greater Bolshevik than the whole of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. The end. Thank you for listening.